Dodge City, the wildest town in the West. Gunmen ruled its streets, and whiskey drowned its conscience. No lawman dared stay for long. But one day, order came from the last place anyone expected, an Apache warrior. This is the forgotten tale of how a lone rider brought justice to the most lawless town in America. Asterisk. The year was 1878, and Dodge City wore chaos like a second skin. Dust swirled endlessly through its crooked streets, carried by the prairie wind that smelled of smoke, whiskey, and horse sweat. Wooden signs creaked over saloons and gambling halls, their paint peeling, their doors forever swinging as cowhands and drifters spilled in and out with the sun still high. By day or night, the town was never quiet. Gunfire cracked without warning, the echo bouncing between clapboard buildings like cruel laughter. Merchants lived in constant fear. Shopkeepers bolted their doors at sundown, praying that their windows wouldn't be smashed before morning. Farmers who brought their cattle to market rarely returned home with both coin and dignity intact. Cards were rigged. Dice were loaded, and fists were always waiting to finish what cheating hands had started. And if a man complained, the answer was usually the same: cold steel or hot lead. The saloons were the pulsing heart of Dodge, and that heart beat black. In the Longhorn, smoke from cheap cigars hung so thick it stung the eyes, and the piano player's fingers barely kept time over the drunken shouts. Whiskey spilled as freely as blood, and it was said that every inch of the bar counter had been stained by one man's life or another. Women worked the room with tired smiles, their painted faces hiding bruises they no longer bothered to conceal. A stranger stepping through the batwing doors could smell the rot of lawlessness before he saw it. Outside, the streets belonged to outlaws. Men strutted with revolvers slung low on their hips, hands twitching for the chance to prove themselves. Drunken cowboys fired shots into the sky just to hear the echo, sending mothers and children scrambling into shadows. Even the bravest townsfolk avoided eye contact, for fear that a passing glare might spark a duel. The sheriff, once the thin line between order and chaos, had abandoned Dodge months earlier. His star-shaped badge still hung in the town office, gathering dust, but no man dared wear it now. Those who had tried lay buried on Boot Hill, some shot in the back, others left to rot in the alleys. To stand for law in Dodge was to sign one's death warrant. The cattle barons fed this chaos. The richer they grew, the more they invested in vice. They kept the saloons stocked, the brothels running, and the gambling dens alive, because a drunk and broken town was easier to control. They hired guns to enforce their will, men with dead eyes and quicker hands than mercy would ever allow. The people of Dodge had long since learned the truth. There was no justice here, only survival. Yet even survival was a gamble. A farmer might lose his last dollar in a rigged poker game. A widow might lose her home to a forged deed. A child might lose his father in a drunken shootout, all before the town clock struck noon. And when the dust settled and the blood dried, life went on as though cruelty were just another cost of living. Still, behind shuttered windows and whispered prayers, a spark of hope lingered. The townsfolk dreamed of someone strong enough to face the wolves, someone who could walk into Dodge and change its fate. They dreamed of a lawman, a gunfighter, a savior. But dreams were fragile in Dodge, easily broken by the next bullet fired across the street. And so the town waited as smoke curled above the rooftops. Waited as boot heels rang on the boardwalks. Waited as women carried water and men buried their dead. Dodge City had become a wound that refused to heal raw, festering, bleeding with every sunrise. No badge dared claim it. No preacher dared bless it. No soldier dared march into it, but change was coming, on the horizon. Beneath the blazing sun, a figure was already riding closer, one who bore no badge, no Bible, no ties to cattle barons. He carried only the scars of war and the silence of the desert. And though Dodge City did not yet know his name, it would never forget the day he arrived. The sun was sinking low, bleeding red across the Kansas sky. Dodge City streets glowed in that fiery light, every shadow stretched long, every sound sharper in the cooling air. Shopkeepers were already shuttering windows, not because the day was done, but because night belonged to killers. And then came the sound, the slow, deliberate beat of hooves on hard-packed dirt. Heads turned. From the southern trail, a rider approached. He was unlike any man Dodge had seen before. Tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, his black hair streamed down his back in the wind. His skin bore the copper hue of the plains, but it was his presence that silenced even the most reckless drunk. The rider did not slouch or swagger. He rode straight, his spine like steel, his eyes scanning the street with calm precision. This was Taza, an Apache warrior. Rumors traveled faster than the prairie wind. By the time his horse's hooves struck the main street, whispers had already darted from porch to saloon, from the brothel to the blacksmith's forge. Apache. Some spat the word like venom. Others hushed their children and pulled them inside. Cowboys muttered curses under their breath. But none could look away. The Longhorn saloon doors creaked open as men spilled out to get a glimpse. Their laughter died the moment they saw him. Here was no ragged drifter. Taza's clothes were worn from the trail, but his weapons were sharp, polished with care. A Winchester rifle rested across his saddle. A revolver hung at his side, its handle smooth from years of use. Around his neck hung a silver medallion, dull with age, the only glint of ornament on a man otherwise built for war. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts. One boy stared openly, wide-eyed, at the warrior who seemed carved from the very desert itself. Taza's gaze flickered briefly toward him, and in that single moment, the boy felt something strange, something like safety. But for the men who thrived on Dodge's chaos, that gaze carried a different weight. Outlaws leaned on porch posts, fingers twitching near holsters. They had seen lawmen ride in before, and none had lasted. What was one Apache against their guns? And yet, something in the way he carried himself unsettled them. He did not fidget. He did not flinch. He rode down the main street as though he owned every inch of it, as though he feared no man, no bullet, no curse. The cattle baron's spies watched from the saloon balcony, narrowing their eyes. They saw not just a stranger, but a threat. A man who might tip the balance of power. A man who could not be bought with whiskey or gold. Taza reined in his horse near the watering trough outside the Longhorn. The animal drank deeply, steam rising from its flanks. The warrior dismounted in silence, his boots landing firm on the dusty earth. Slowly, he removed his hat and scanned the street. His eyes met those of every outlaw, every coward, every soul who dared to hold his gaze. Most looked away. The air grew thick. The piano in the saloon stopped mid-tune. Even the wind seemed to hush, waiting. Taza tied his horse, adjusted the rifle on his back, and pushed open the swinging doors of the Longhorn. He didn't need to announce himself. His arrival alone was a declaration. Dodge City was no longer the same. Inside, voices would challenge him. Guns would test him. But the people outside already knew one thing for certain: the storm had arrived, and it had the face of an Apache. The Longhorn saloon was louder than a thunderstorm that evening. Laughter, curses, and the clatter of poker chips rolled through the smoke-thick air. A piano hammered out a broken tune in the corner, barely heard over the shouting. Men crowded tables stacked with whiskey bottles, their eyes sharp with greed, their hands never far from iron. Into this den of chaos walked Taza. The swinging doors creaked as he stepped inside, the lamplight flickering across his scarred face. For a moment, no one noticed him. But silence spreads quick in a place where violence is never far. The piano notes faltered, Dice rolled to a stop and heads began to turn. Conversations died mid-sentence as men sized up the stranger who dared step into their world. Tazia moved with the steady patience of a man who had faced worse than drunken cowhands. He crossed the room without hurry, boots thudding on the warped floorboards. His eyes scanned everything: the gamblers, the barmaids, the shadows near the staircase where hired guns leaned in the dark. He saw them all, and he saw through them. At the far poker table, a gambler with greasy hair and a mean grin spat tobacco into the sawdust. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Ain't every day a redskin strolls in here like he owns the place." Laughter followed, harsh and ugly. A few men slapped the table, waiting to see blood. Taza said nothing. He stood tall, silent as stone, his expression unreadable. He walked toward the bar, ordered a glass of water, and drank slowly. That silence, calm, unbothered, only stoked the gambler's anger. The man rose, shoving his chair back, the legs screeching across the floor. "Don't reckon you heard me, savage," he sneered, one hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. "You got no business in Dodge. Best ride back to your desert before I send you to meet your ancestors." The crowd leaned forward. Here it was, the moment when this stranger would either back down or die. Tazi set his glass on the counter, the faint clink cutting through the silence. Then he turned, slow and deliberate, his eyes locking onto the gambler. No words, just that stare-sharp, unblinking, a warning older than any gun law. The gambler's face twitched. Pride forced his hand where common sense begged him to stop. In a blur, he drew his pistol, the barrel flashing under the lamplight, but Taza was faster. Before the man could aim, Taza's hand lashed out. In one fluid motion, he gripped the gambler's wrist, twisted it until the bone popped, and slammed him against the table. The pistol clattered across the floor. The gambler howled in pain, face pressed into spilled whiskey and cards. Gasps filled the saloon. No one had even seen the Apache move until it was over. Taza leaned down, his voice low but sharp as a knife. "This town has forgotten respect. Tonight it remembers." Then he released the gambler, letting him crumple to the floor like a broken puppet. The room stayed dead quiet. The outlaws who had laughed moments before now sat stiff, hands far from their holsters. The barmaid, still clutching her tray, stared in awe. The gambler scrambled out the door, cradling his ruined wrist, curses spilling from his lips. No one followed him. No one dared. Taza adjusted the rifle on his back and returned to the bar as if nothing had happened. He finished his drink. Only then did the room breathe again. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Did you see him?" Faster than a rattler. Never blinked, not once. For the first time in months, Dodge City felt something it had nearly forgotten. Not fear. Not chaos. Order. And it had arrived in the hands of an Apache warrior. The morning after the saloon fight, Dodge City woke with new whispers on its tongue. Word of the Apache warrior's speed, his strength, and the way he'd humiliated the gambler had spread faster than prairie fire. Some outlaws were furious, swearing revenge. But the ordinary folk, the widows, the shopkeepers, the weary farmers whispered something else entirely. Hope. For weeks, the people of Dodge had lived like shadows in their own town. They had learned to step aside, to bow their heads, to pray the storm of chaos passed them by. But now, for the first time, they wondered if they could stand a little taller. Not because the law had returned, no man had dared pin on the sheriff's badge, but because an Apache had shown them that bullies could bleed. Taza did not vanish after his clash in the Longhorn. He walked the streets with the same steady stride, unmoved by glares or muttered insults. But he did not waste his time on the outlaws. Instead, he turned his attention to those whom Dodge had forgotten. Outside the mercantile, He stopped to help an elderly man lift a barrel too heavy for his back. He repaired a broken wagon wheel for a farmer's wife while her children watched wide-eyed, whispering about the warrior stronger than 10 men. When he saw 2 boys arguing over a stick, he crouched beside them and, with patient hands, showed them how to notch a branch into a bow. The children's laughter rang through the dusty street, a sound Dodge had not heard in months without fear close behind it. At first, suspicion lingered. A widow named Clara, who had lost her husband in a cattle baron's ambush, watched him from behind her curtain. She saw him offer bread to a hungry child, his movements gentle despite his size. She saw him stand quietly outside the church on Sunday, never entering, but bowing his head in silence as the bells tolled. And slowly, suspicion gave way to something softer. One afternoon, a group of drunken cowhands tried to harass Clara on her way back from the well. Before their laughter could sour into violence, Taza appeared. He did not shout or brandish his weapon. He simply stood between them and the widow, his shadow swallowing theirs. His silence was enough. The men muttered curses but backed away, their bravado shriveling under his gaze. Clara, shaken, whispered her thanks. Taza nodded once, then walked on. No reward, no praise. Protection was simply what he did. By nightfall, the stories had grown. Some said Taza could see danger before it came. Others claimed his knife never missed, his rifle never wavered. Children invented games where they pretended to be the Apache warrior chasing away invisible villains. And the people of Dodge, those who had been powerless for so long, began to imagine that they, too, could stand beside him. The cattle baron's men noticed. They saw the shift in the town's eyes, the way merchants straightened their shoulders, the way widows no longer shrank when hired guns walked by. This was dangerous. Fear kept Dodge under the baron's thumb. Respect for an outsider no less threatened to break his hold. But for now, the townsfolk found small courage in simple acts. A blacksmith offered to sharpen Taza's blade. The preacher, though wary, nodded to him in the street. Even the barkeep of the Longhorn kept a glass of water ready, sliding it across the counter without a word when Taza entered. Dodge City was changing. Slowly, carefully, like dawn creeping across the horizon. And at the center of it all stood the warrior who had chosen no badge, no office, no claim to power. Taza belonged to no law but his own. Yet in his presence, the weak began to feel strong again. For the first time in years, Dodge City dared to hope that justice had not died after all. While the townsfolk whispered hope, another man whispered hatred. His name was Silas McGraw, the wealthiest cattle baron in the region. His empire stretched across the plains like an iron claw, built not on hard work but on blood. McGraw thrived on Dodge City's lawlessness. He kept the saloons full, the gambling halls crooked, the outlaws paid, and the sheriff's office empty. Every fistfight, every swindle, every gunshot meant more control for him. And now, one man, an Apache warrior, threatened it all. McGraw sat in his grand office above the Golden Spur Saloon, a cigar smoldering in his hand, the smoke curling like a snake. His boots were polished, his vest trimmed with gold thread, and a pistol rested on his desk not for defense, but as a reminder of who truly ruled Dodge. From his balcony, he watched the streets below and scowled. Where once people scurried like rats, now they stood taller. The blacksmith whistled while he worked. Clara the widow walked the street with her head high. Even the children laughed openly. All of it because of that Apache, that outsider who dared to stand where McGraw said no man should. "This won't stand," McGraw muttered, crushing his cigar into the ashtray. "If Dodge forgets fear, it forgets me." He summoned his lieutenants, hard-eyed gunmen with whiskey on their breath and death on their hands. They gathered in his office, boots muddy from the trail, rifles slung across their shoulders. Men who had burned barns, broken families, and shot sheriffs without hesitation. McGraw leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "This Taza, this savage, he's turning my town soft. The people whisper his name like he's some kind of saint. I want him gone, broken, buried. Do you understand?" The men grinned, eager for blood. But McGraw was not finished. "I don't care how fast he is with a gun. We'll bleed him out slow. We'll set fires, stir chaos, remind these fools who owns Dodge, and when he comes running to help them, we'll put him in the ground." The plan was simple: overwhelm him. They sent riders to hire every drifter and gunslinger from the neighboring towns, men hungry for coin and unconcerned with honor. Soon, Dodge began to fill with new faces, hard-eyed killers who leaned in doorways, spat tobacco into the dirt, and kept their hands close to their holsters. The townsfolk noticed. The brief comfort they had felt began to shrink as shadows returned to Dodge. Farmers whispered of strangers camping on the outskirts. The preacher warned of dark times brewing. But Taza walked the streets as steady as ever, his presence a wall against their growing fear. One evening, Clara intercepted him outside her home. "They're gathering against you," she warned, her voice tight with worry. "The cattle baron won't let you change this town. He'll burn it before he gives it up." Taza studied her, his face calm, his eyes sharp. "Then Dodge must choose," he said simply. "Choose?" She echoed. "Fear. Or courage." And with that, he walked on, leaving Clara to realize the truth. Taza could not fight this war alone. By the week's end, Dodge was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Outlaws roamed the streets with fresh arrogance, shoving townsfolk aside, smashing windows, demanding coin. Barns mysteriously caught fire. Shots rang out at night. The cattle baron's message was clear. The Apache had no place here. But in the hearts of the people, another message had already taken root. They saw the courage in Taza's stride, the steadiness in his silence. And for the first time, some dared to think, if we stand with him, perhaps Dodge can be ours again. The storm was coming. Everyone felt it. And in the center of that storm stood Silas McGraw, a man who had ruled by fear for too long now, ready to unleash his wrath against the warrior who defied him. The sun sank behind the prairie, painting the horizon blood red, as if the sky itself foresaw what was coming. Dodge City settled into uneasy silence. Families shuttered their windows, mothers hushed their children, and even the dogs seemed to sense danger prowling in the shadows. Then it began. The first blaze tore through a barn on the outskirts of town. The flames licked upward, devouring the dry wood in minutes, sending sparks spiraling into the night. By the time the bucket line formed, a second fire erupted, this time in the general store. Goods and hopes alike went up in smoke. People screamed. Bells rang. Dodge was under siege. Silas McGraw's men moved through the streets like wolves in the dark, setting torches to rooftops, firing shots into the air, dragging men out of saloons and beating them bloody. They were chaos incarnate, a storm unleashed with one purpose: to break the will of the town and to flush Taza into the open. And he came. From the darkness, Taza strode forward, his figure silhouetted against the inferno. His long hair whipped in the hot wind, his rifle slung across his back, his tomahawk gleaming in his hand. The outlaws froze at the sight of him, for even in the firelight he seemed larger than life, as though the flames themselves bowed to his presence. "Leave this place," Taza's voice thundered above the crackle of fire. "Or face me." The response was a shotgun blast. The buckshot tore into the dirt at his feet, but Taza did not flinch. With a roar, he lunged forward, his tomahawk flashing, his fist cracking into the jaw of the nearest outlaw. The man dropped like a stone. Taza grabbed his rifle and spun, firing into the air, not to kill, but to signal. The townsfolk, who had been cowering in doorways, now stirred. Clara emerged, rallying the women to douse the flames. The blacksmith hefted his hammer, standing beside Taza. Even the preacher raised a rifle that had long gathered dust. The tide began to shift, but McGraw's men were many. Gunshots rattled the night. Windows shattered. Horses screamed in panic. The outlaws pressed forward, circling, trying to overwhelm the lone warrior and the handful of townsfolk who dared resist. Taza fought like a storm given flesh. He moved with a rhythm no gunslinger could match, dipping, striking, vanishing into smoke, then reappearing where the enemy least expected. His tomahawk struck wood, metal, and flesh alike. His voice called out commands. Form a line. Protect the children. Drive them back. Every word was an anchor for the frightened townsfolk, and slowly, courage spread like wildfire to match the flames. Men who had once hidden behind whiskey bottles now raised their fists. Women who had been silenced by fear now shouted orders and hurled buckets of water onto the burning roofs. And still, the night grew bloodier. One outlaw hurled a torch into Clara's home, laughing as it caught the curtains. She screamed, but before the fire could spread, Taza was there, bursting through the doorway, ripping down the flames with his bare hands, tossing the smoldering fabric into the street. His arms blistered, his chest heaved, but his eyes never wavered. By midnight, Dodge was scarred and smoldering, but not destroyed. The townsfolk had fought back harder than McGraw ever imagined. His men retreated into the darkness, leaving behind broken windows, burned homes, and the echoes of gunfire, and in the town square, amidst the ash and ruin, stood Taza, bloodied, burned, but unbroken. The people gathered around him, their faces streaked with soot, their voices hushed. For the first time, they looked not just at a warrior, but at a leader. Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. They came to burn us down, and still we stand. Because of him, the crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding, some weeping. And for the first time in years, Dodge City felt something new in its bones, not fear, not despair, but defiance. Above them, the fires still smoldered, painting the night with smoke. The war for Dodge was not over, but the people had made their choice. They would stand with the Apache warrior, and Silas McGraw would soon learn what it meant to fight a town united. Morning came to Dodge City, heavy and gray, the sky swollen with storm clouds, though no rain fell. The town lay quiet, its streets scarred by the fires of the night before. Charred beams still smoked, glass crunched under boots, and the scent of ash clung to the air. But amidst the ruin, the people stood straighter. Dodge had not broken, and Silas McGraw knew it. From his balcony above the Golden Spur Saloon, the cattle baron watched the townsfolk sweep debris from the streets, hammer boards over shattered windows, and lift one another from despair. His jaw clenched. His empire had thrived on fear, but now fear was slipping through his fingers. There was only one way left to keep control. Kill the Apache. So he sent his challenge. By noon, word had spread like wildfire. Silas McGraw had called Taza out. No ambush, no hired guns this time, a duel, man to man, in the heart of Dodge City. The Baron's pride demanded nothing less, and his cruelty promised he would turn it into a spectacle. When the hour came, the town gathered. Men, women, and children lined the streets, faces pale, hearts pounding. Some clutched rifles, though none dared interfere. This was between two men, the tyrant who had ruled Dodge and the warrior who had defied him. McGraw swaggered into the street first. His black coat swayed with each step, gold buttons gleaming in the dim light. His hat shadowed his cruel eyes, but the smirk on his lips was plain. He carried a silver-plated revolver, heavy and polished, its grip worn from many kills. Taza arrived moments later. No coat, no finery, only the worn buckskin across his chest, the tomahawk at his hip, and the Colt revolver holstered at his side. His face bore the burns and bruises of the night before, yet his stride was steady, his gaze unshaken. The two men faced one another in the center of the street, 20 paces apart. "You should have left when you had the chance," McGraw sneered, his voice loud enough for the crowd. "This town isn't yours. It never will be." Taza's reply was quiet but carried through the hush. "Dodge belongs to its people. Not to fear. Not to you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then came the signal. A church bell tolled in the distance. Hands hovered near holsters. Eyes narrowed. Time stretched thin. McGraw drew first faster than most men could blink. His revolver roared, the bullets slicing through the air. But Taza was already moving, dropping low, his own Colt flashing in reply. The crowd gasped as McGraw's hat flew from his head, the bullet grazing his scalp instead of his heart. Enraged, McGraw fired again and again, the shots wild, desperate. Taza rolled, sprang to his feet, and advanced, his step sure, his arm steady. He fired once more, this time striking McGraw in the shoulder, spinning him backward, blood blossoming across his fine coat. The Baron staggered, clutching his wound, but still he raised his gun, snarling like a cornered wolf. Before he could pull the trigger, Taza was upon him. With a cry that echoed down the street, the Apache swung his tomahawk, knocking the revolver clean from McGraw's hand. Now unarmed, the cattle baron stumbled back, his eyes wide with the first taste of true fear. "Please," he gasped, his voice breaking. Don't kill me. I'll leave. I'll give you the town, the cattle, everything." Taza stood over him, chest heaving, tomahawk raised. The crowd held its breath. They expected blood. They expected the final blow, but instead Taza lowered the weapon. His voice was calm, resolute. Dodge doesn't need another tyrant. It needs freedom. He turned his back on McGraw, leaving him groveling in the dirt. Two townsmen stepped forward, seizing the cattle baron by the arms. For the first time in years, Silas McGraw had no power. The crowd erupted, not in cheers of vengeance, but in cries of triumph. Some wept openly, others shouted Taza's name, their voices rising like thunder. Dodge City had seen its darkest night, and now it had witnessed the dawn of change, and at the center of it all stood the Apache warrior, who had faced a tyrant and given a broken town the strength to rise. The storm clouds that had hung heavy over Dodge City finally broke not with rain, but with light. As the dawn spilled across the plains, it gilded the battered rooftops, the scarred streets, and the weary faces of the townsfolk with a golden glow. For the first time in years, Dodge City felt new. Silas McGraw was gone, hauled away in disgrace, his empire crumbling as quickly as his reputation. The Golden Spur, once the center of his corruption, stood silent, its doors chained shut. Where fear had ruled, the people now walked freely, but it had not come without cost. The fires of that terrible night still lingered. Charred beams jutted like broken teeth from ruined barns. Families swept the ashes of their homes into the wind. Scars lined both the town and its people. Yet within those scars was a strange strength. Born of survival. At the heart of it all stood Taza. He did not claim the sheriff's badge, nor demand authority. Instead, he worked alongside the townsfolk. At sunrise, he helped rebuild Clara's home, carrying timbers on his back without complaint. By noon, he taught the blacksmith's boy how to shoot straight, not for vengeance, but for defense. At dusk, he sat with the preacher, mapping out patrols so that Dodge would never again fall to outlaws in the night. The people followed his lead, not because he commanded, but because he showed them what it meant to stand together. Clara often watched him from her porch, her heart torn between gratitude and something deeper. One evening she approached him as he repaired the well near the square. "You could leave now," she said softly. "The Baron's gone. You've done what you came to do." Taza looked up, his dark eyes steady. "If I leave, Dodge may forget. Fear always returns when courage fades," she smiled faintly. "Then stay. Not as our savior. As one of us." The words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful. For the first time since he had arrived, Taza allowed himself to imagine a life here, not as an outsider, not as a warrior always on the move, but as a man among people who finally understood him. Weeks passed and Dodge changed. The saloons no longer swallowed men whole. The schoolhouse reopened, laughter spilling from its windows. Farmers brought their cattle through town without paying Mikraw's blood toll. On Sundays, the church bells rang not as warnings, but as invitations. Word spread across the plains. Travelers arrived, astonished to see Dodge City once called the wickedest town in the West reborn. And always, the story was the same. It was the Apache who brought order. But Taza never claimed the title of lawman or hero. He said little, preferring action to words. And yet, every boy who carried water to his worksite, every girl who ran to tell him about her lessons, every farmer who shook his hand knew the truth. He was the reason Dodge lived again. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, the townsfolk gathered in the square. Clara stood beside Taza, her hand brushing his as the preacher raised his voice. This town was broken. Fear was our master. But we are free because one man chose to stand. Today, Dodge City belongs not to outlaws nor cattle barons, but to its people. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing into the plains. Children laughed, women wept, men raised their hats high. And at the center of it all, Taza bowed his head, not in pride, but in humility, for he knew the truth. Dodge had been saved not by one warrior, but by a town that had finally remembered its own strength. Yet still, as the wind whispered through the plains and the stars blinked awake, the people knew they owed their rebirth to him, the Apache warrior who had brought order to Dodge City, and his name would live in their stories for generations to come.